The war had begun long before the first shot was fired, long before the skies over Earth darkened with the silhouettes of alien warships. Humanity had always known that it was not alone in the universe, but the day that knowledge was confirmed came with a wave of terror and destruction that no one could have foreseen. The Zartan, a race of insectoid aliens with advanced technology and a hive-like mentality, had arrived without warning, their ships blotting out the sun as they descended upon Earth's cities. The initial strikes were swift and devastating, targeting communication hubs, military bases, and centers of government. Within hours, the world was plunged into chaos as the Zartan's plasma weapons turned once thriving metropolises into smoldering ruins. The alien invaders moved with cold efficiency, their insectoid warriors sweeping through the streets, annihilating anything that stood in their way. Humanity's response was fractured and disorganized, the various nations of Earth struggling to coordinate a defense against an enemy that seemed invincible. In the early days of the invasion, the human forces were pushed to the brink of annihilation. Entire battalions were wiped out in seconds, their soldiers reduced to ash by the searing plasma bolts fired from the Zartan's weapons. The air was thick with the smell of burning flesh and the acrid stench of destruction as the once mighty cities of Earth crumbled under the relentless assault. In New York, the towering skyscrapers that had once symbolized human achievement now lay in ruins, their twisted steel frames jutting out of the ground like the bones of some long-dead giant. The survivors, those few who had managed to escape the initial onslaught, huddled in the darkness, their faces gaunt with fear and despair. Among them was Jeffrey Holmes, a soldier who had once served with distinction in the United States Army. Now he was little more than a fugitive, a man on the run from an enemy that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. Jeffrey had seen friends and comrades die in the most horrific ways imaginable, their bodies torn apart by the Zartan's brutal weapons. He had watched as the world he knew was reduced to rubble, as the structures and institutions that had once given him a sense of purpose and belonging crumbled into dust. But even in the face of such overwhelming despair, Jeffrey had refused to give up. He had retreated into the sewers and subways of New York, gathering around him a small band of survivors, men and women who, like him, had lost everything but were determined to fight on. They were a ragtag group, their bodies gaunt and their spirits battered, but they were united by a single burning desire to take back their world or die trying. As they moved through the dark, dank tunnels beneath the city, Jeffrey could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. Every decision he made could mean the difference between life and death for the people who had chosen to follow him. He knew that they were running out of time. The Zartan were relentless, their forces scouring the city above for any signs of resistance. It was only a matter of time before they were discovered, and when that happened, there would be no escape. But Jeffrey was not about to go down without a fight. He had heard rumors, whispers among the survivors, of a secret Zartan command post located in the heart of the city. It was said to be heavily guarded, its location concealed from human detection by advanced alien technology. But if they could find it, if they could somehow infiltrate it and gather the intel they needed, it might just give them the edge they needed to turn the tide of the war. It was a long shot, a suicide mission by any other name, but it was the only chance they had. Jeffrey and his team emerged from the tunnels into the ruins of what had once been Central Park. The once vibrant green space was now a wasteland, the trees charred and blackened, the grass scorched into ash. In the distance, the remains of the city's skyline loomed like the ghosts of a forgotten age. The command post, if it existed, would be somewhere within that desolate landscape, hidden among the ruins of the city. Jeffrey's heart pounded in his chest as they moved cautiously through the rubble, his rifle at the ready. The air was thick with tension, every shadow a potential threat, every sound a harbinger of doom. They had been moving for what felt like hours when they finally saw it, a structure that looked out of place among the ruins, its sleek metallic walls gleaming in the dim light. It was heavily fortified, surrounded by a perimeter of Zartan warriors, their exoskeletons glinting in the darkness. Jeffrey knew that they had only one chance to get this right. If they were discovered before they could breach the defenses, they would be cut, down where they stood. He motioned for his team to take cover behind a nearby pile of debris, scanning the area for any signs of movement. The Zartan were methodical in their patrols, their insectoid eyes scanning the area with cold precision. But Jeffrey had trained for this. He had spent years honing his skills in the art of stealth and infiltration, and he was not about to let some alien bugs get the better of him. He waited for the perfect moment, his breath held in his throat, and then he moved. With the speed and silence of a predator, he slipped through the shadows, his team following close behind. They reached the perimeter undetected, crouching low behind the cover of a fallen wall. The Zartan were close, too close for comfort, but they were focused on their patrols, unaware of the danger lurking just beyond their line of sight. Jeffrey signaled to his team, and they moved as one, scaling the wall and dropping silently into the compound. The interior of the command post was a maze of corridors and chambers, each one filled with alien technology that Jeffrey could barely comprehend. The walls were lined with strange, pulsing conduits, and the air hummed with the energy of advanced machinery. They moved quickly but cautiously, their senses on high alert. Jeffrey's heart raced as they passed through the corridors, his mind racing with thoughts of what they might find. If they could secure the intel they needed, it might just give them the edge they needed to strike back against the Zartan. But as they moved deeper into the compound, Jeffrey couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The place was too quiet, too empty. It was as if the Zartan had known they were coming. His fears were confirmed when they reached the central chamber, a vast, cavernous room filled with rows of alien consoles and data terminals. At the far end of the room stood a figure, its silhouette shrouded in darkness. As they approached, the figure stepped forward, revealing itself to be a Zartan commander, its mandibles clicking in a grotesque parody of laughter. Jeffrey barely had time to react before the room was flooded with Zartan warriors, their weapons trained on the intruders. The trap had been sprung and there was no way out. But Jeffrey was not about to go down without a fight. He raised his rifle, firing off a burst of rounds that tore through the nearest Zartan warrior, sending it crashing to the ground. His team followed suit, their weapons lighting up the room as they engaged the enemy in a desperate battle for survival. The air was filled with the sounds of gunfire and the screams of the dying as the two sides clashed in a brutal, close-quarters fight. Jeffrey's heart pounded in his chest as he fought with everything he had, his mind focused on one thing and one thing only: survival. They had to get out of here, had to find a way to escape before it was too late. But the Zartan were relentless, their numbers overwhelming. For every alien they took down, two more seemed to take its place. Jeffrey's rifle clicked empty, and he quickly reloaded, his hands moving with practiced precision. But even as he fought, he knew that they were running out of time. The Zartan were closing in, their weapons glowing with deadly energy. Jeffrey felt a surge of panic as he realized that they were trapped, with no way out and no hope of survival. But then something strange happened. As the Zartan closed in for the kill, the room was suddenly bathed in a blinding light. For a moment, Jeffrey thought it was the end, that they had been caught in some kind of alien weapon that would vaporize them where they stood. But then he saw it, a group of human soldiers, their armor gleaming in the light, their weapons trained on the Zartan. They moved with the precision of a well-oiled machine, their movements synchronized as they unleashed a hail of gunfire on the alien invaders. The Zartan were caught off guard, their ranks thrown into chaos as they were cut down by the sudden onslaught. Jeffrey watched in disbelief as the tide of the battle suddenly turned. The human soldiers moved with a speed and efficiency that he had never seen before, their weapons tearing through the Zartan with devastating accuracy. Within minutes, the room was littered with the bodies of the fallen, the air thick with the stench of death. The Zartan were routed, their remaining forces fleeing in disarray as the human soldiers pressed the attack. Jeffrey's heart raced as he realized what had just happened. They had been saved by a force that he had thought was long gone, the last remnants of humanity's military, still fighting, still defying the odds. He watched as the leader of the group, a tall, imposing figure in advanced combat armor, approached him. The soldier's face was obscured by a helmet, but there was no mistaking the authority in his voice as he spoke. "Are you Jeffrey Holmes?" the soldier asked, his voice muffled by the helmet. Jeffrey nodded, still trying to process what had just happened. "I'm Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Hayes," the soldier said, extending a hand. "We've been looking for you." Jeffrey shook the offered hand, still in shock. "How did you find us?" he asked. "We've been monitoring the Zartans' communications," Hayes replied. "We knew they were setting a trap, but we also knew that you were our best shot at getting the intel we need to strike back." Jeffrey nodded, his mind racing. They had a chance, a real chance to turn the tide of the war. But it would take more than just a few soldiers. It would take an army of human soldiers to take back their world from the alien invaders. And Jeffrey was ready to lead them. Jeffrey stood there, his heart pounding in his chest as the reality of the situation began to sink in. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but this unexpected turn of events had rekindled a flicker of hope that he hadn't felt in a long time. The human soldiers who had come to their rescue moved with the practiced efficiency of veterans, securing the area, checking for survivors, and scanning the alien technology for any useful intel. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Hayes, the leader of the group, was a man of few words, his every movement purposeful and precise. As Jeffrey took in the sight of these soldiers, he realized that they represented something more than just a lifeline in the midst of a desperate situation. They represented the enduring spirit of humanity, a spirit that refused to be crushed even in the face of overwhelming odds. "We don't have much time," Hayes said, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable sense of urgency. "The Zartan will regroup and come at us again, and next time they'll be even more prepared. We need to get out of here, and we need to do it now." Jeffrey nodded, quickly rallying his team. They were battered and bruised, their faces etched with exhaustion. But there was a new fire in their eyes, a fire fueled by the presence of these soldiers and the knowledge that they were not alone. As they moved through the compound, following Hayes and his men, Jeffrey couldn't help but feel a surge of admiration for these warriors. They were the best of the best, the last remnants of Earth's once mighty military forces, and they had somehow managed to survive and continue the fight against the Zartan, even when all hope seemed lost. The journey back to the surface was fraught with danger, the corridors echoing with the distant sounds of alien movement. The Zartan were relentless, their forces prowling the halls in search of the intruders who had dared to infiltrate their stronghold. But Hayes and his soldiers were prepared, their advanced weapons and armor giving them the edge they needed to outmaneuver and outgun the alien invaders. As they ascended through the levels of the compound, Jeffrey marveled at the discipline and skill of these soldiers. Every action was executed with precision, every shot fired with deadly accuracy. It was as if they were moving as one, their minds and bodies perfectly synchronized in the heat of battle. Finally, they reached the surface, emerging into the night air. The ruins of New York City stretched out before them, a desolate landscape illuminated by the eerie glow of the Zartan's technology. The once great city, now little more than a smoldering wasteland, bore silent witness to the devastation that had befallen Earth. But there, in the midst of the ruins, stood a beacon of hope, a military transport, its engines humming quietly as it awaited the return of its passengers. Hayes motioned for the group to board, his gaze sweeping the horizon for any signs of approaching danger. As they climbed into the transport, Jeffrey couldn't shake the feeling that this was the beginning of something much bigger than himself, bigger than any of them. The fight for Earth was far from over, but for the first time since the invasion began, he felt that they might actually have a chance. The transport lifted off the ground, its engines roaring to life as it soared into the night sky. Below them, the city faded into the distance, swallowed by the darkness. Jeffrey took a deep breath, allowing himself a moment to reflect on everything that had happened. The losses they had suffered, the horrors they had witnessed, the desperate fight for survival, it had all led to this moment. "Where are we headed?" Jeffrey asked, breaking the silence that had settled over the group. "To a safe zone," Hayes replied, his voice steady. "One of the last we have left. From there, we'll regroup, plan our next move, and strike back." Jeffrey nodded, grateful for the clarity and resolve in Hayes's words. There was no doubt in the lieutenant colonel's mind about what needed to be done, and that confidence was contagious. As the transport sped through the night, Jeffrey allowed himself to hope. Hope that they could reclaim their world. Hope that they could drive the Zartine from their planet. Hope that humanity would rise from the ashes stronger than ever before. The safe zone was a far cry from the military bases Jeffrey remembered from before the invasion. It was located deep underground, hidden within a vast network of tunnels that had been constructed in secret long before the first alien ship arrived in Earth's orbit. The entrance was disguised as a nondescript warehouse on the outskirts of a small town, one of many such facilities scattered across the country. As the transport descended into the tunnel system, Jeffrey could feel the tension in the air, the weight of what they were about to undertake pressing down on everyone. This was a place of last resort, a final bastion for the human race, and it carried the hopes and dreams of every man, woman, and child who had survived the initial onslaught. When the transport finally touched down in the main hangar, the group disembarked in silence. The hangar was a hive of activity, soldiers and technicians moving with purpose as they prepared for the next phase of the fight. Jeffrey's team, still reeling from the events of the past few hours, looked around in awe at the sheer scale of the operation. Here, deep underground, humanity was preparing for war, a war that would determine the fate of the planet. "We don't have much time," Hayes said, addressing the group. "The Zartan are regrouping, and we need to be ready to strike back before they can launch another assault. We've got intel on several key targets, but we're going to need every resource we have to pull this off." Jeffrey stepped forward, his resolve hardening with each passing moment. "What do you need from us?" Hayes looked at him, a hint of approval in his gaze. "We need fighters, people who can think on their feet, who aren't afraid to get their hands dirty. Your team has already proven that you're capable of handling yourselves in a fight. We could use you." Jeffrey nodded, his mind already racing with plans. He knew that the fight ahead would be unlike anything they had faced before, but he was ready. They were all ready. The war was far from over, but they had a chance to turn the tide, to reclaim their world, to ensure that humanity would not go quietly into the night. The days that followed were a blur of activity. Jeffrey and his team were integrated into the broader resistance force, their skills put to use in planning and executing a series of daring raids on Zartan-controlled facilities. These strikes were designed to disrupt the alien supply lines, weaken their defenses, and sow chaos among their ranks. The safe zone itself was a marvel of engineering, a sprawling complex that stretched for miles underground, with living quarters, training facilities, and armories all interconnected by a labyrinth of tunnels. It was a fortress, designed to withstand even the most determined assault, and it was here that the resistance would make its stand. The leadership of the resistance, a council of military officers, scientists, and civilian leaders, worked tirelessly to coordinate the war effort. They pored over maps and intelligence reports, identifying targets and planning operations with the precision of a surgeon. Every decision was weighed carefully, every risk calculated, because they knew that failure was not an option. The Zartan were a formidable enemy, but they were not invincible, and the resistance was determined to exploit every weakness. Jeffrey quickly found himself at the center of these operations. His experience, his knowledge of the enemy, and his ability to think on his feet made him an invaluable asset. He was given command of a strike team, a group of elite soldiers who specialized in hit-and-run tactics, sabotage, and infiltration. Their mission was to strike at the heart of the Zartan's war machine, to cripple their ability to wage war and to buy time for the rest of humanity to regroup and rebuild. The first mission was a test, a raid on a Zartan outpost located deep within the mountains of Colorado. The outpost was a critical supply hub for the alien forces, and its destruction would severely hamper their operations in the region. The approach was treacherous, the mountainous terrain providing ample cover for ambushes and patrols. Jeffrey led his team through the rugged landscape, their movements careful and deliberate. They were a small force, outnumbered and outgunned, but they had the element of surprise on their side. As they neared the outpost, the team went silent, their communication reduced to hand signals and whispered commands. The Zartan had deployed advanced sensors and automated defenses around the perimeter, but Jeffrey had studied the layout of the facility extensively, and he knew where the gaps were. They slipped through the defenses like ghosts, moving quickly and efficiently towards their objective. The outpost was a hive of activity, Zartan warriors and drones moving about with their usual cold efficiency. The aliens were unaware of the danger that was closing in on them, their focus entirely on their tasks. Jeffrey signaled his team to take up their positions around the central command structure. This was the nerve center of the outpost, the place where all the data and communications were routed. If they could take it down, the entire facility would be thrown into disarray. He waited for the right moment, his heart pounding in his chest as he watched the seconds tick by. Then, with a sharp nod, he gave the order. The attack was swift and brutal. The team moved as one, their weapons blazing as they tore through the alien defenders. The Zartan, caught completely off guard, scrambled to respond, but it was too late. Jeffrey's team had already breached the command structure, their charges planted and ready to detonate. The explosion that followed was deafening, the shockwave rippling through the facility and sending the remaining Zartan into a frenzy. But the team was already gone, slipping away into the night as the outpost collapsed behind them. The raid was a success, and it sent a clear message to the Zartan: humanity was not defeated, not by a long shot. The Resistance's tactics were working, and the alien invaders were beginning to realize that they were up against a force far more resilient than they had anticipated. But the cost was high. Each mission took its toll, and the losses mounted with each engagement. Jeffrey's team became known as the Ghosts, a shadowy force that struck without warning and disappeared just as quickly. But the pressure was immense, and the weight of command began to bear down on him. The missions continued, each one more daring and more dangerous than the last. They targeted supply depots, communications hubs, weapons factories, anything that would disrupt the Zartan's operations and give humanity a fighting chance. The Resistance's ranks swelled as more survivors joined the fight, their resolve hardened by the knowledge that they were no longer alone. But with each victory, the Zartan grew more desperate, their retaliation more fierce. The alien invaders were not used to being challenged, and their frustration was evident in the increasing brutality of their tactics. Despite the successes, Jeffrey couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. The Zartan's forces were vast, their resources seemingly endless, and for every outpost they destroyed, 2 more seemed to spring up in its place. The Resistance was fighting a war of attrition, and while they were inflicting significant damage on the enemy, they were also suffering heavy losses. Morale was beginning to waver, and Jeffrey knew that they needed a major victory, something that would turn the tide of the war in their favor. It was during one of these missions that Jeffrey received a piece of intelligence that would change everything. The Resistance had intercepted a communication between high-ranking Zartan officers discussing a new weapon that was being developed at a top-secret facility deep within the aliens' territory. This weapon, if completed, had the potential to wipe out entire cities in a single strike. It was a doomsday device, a last-ditch effort by the Zartan to bring humanity to its knees. Jeffrey knew that they had to stop it, no matter the cost. The operation would be the most dangerous they had ever undertaken, a full-scale assault on a heavily fortified Zartan base. The odds were slim, and the chances of success even slimmer, but there was no other choice. If they failed, it would mean the end of everything they had fought for, the end of humanity's resistance. The days leading up to the operation were tense, the air thick with anticipation. Every soldier in the Resistance knew what was at stake, and the weight of that knowledge hung over them like a dark cloud. Jeffrey spent hours in the command center, going over the plans, coordinating with other strike teams, and preparing his own squad for the mission. There was no room for error, no margin for mistakes. Everything had to go perfectly, or it would all be over. The night before the operation, Jeffrey found himself unable to sleep. He wandered through the corridors of the safe zone, his mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. He thought of the people they had lost, the friends and comrades who had given their lives for this cause. He thought of the civilians who were counting on them, the families who had been torn apart by the invasion. And he thought of the Zartan, the cold, calculating enemy that had brought so much destruction to their world. As he walked, he found himself in the small chapel that had been set up within the safe zone. It was a simple room, sparsely decorated, but it was a place of solace for those who needed it. Jeffrey sat down in one of the pews, his head in his hands. He wasn't a religious man, but in that moment, he felt the weight of everything pressing down on him, and he found himself praying, not for victory, but for the strength to see this through, for the courage to do what needed to be done. The day of the operation dawned gray and cold, the sky heavy with clouds. The strike teams assembled in the hangar, their faces set with grim determination. Jeffrey looked at each of his team members, seeing the resolve in their eyes. They knew the risks, they knew the odds, but they were ready. They had come too far to turn back now. The transport lifted off, carrying them towards their target. The Zartan base was located deep in a mountain range, its defenses formidable and its approach treacherous. The plan was simple in its execution, but complex in its coordination. While the main force created a diversion at the front gates, Jeffrey's team would infiltrate the facility from the rear, using the knowledge they had gained from previous missions to bypass the security systems and reach the heart of the base. As the transport neared the drop zone, the tension in the air was palpable. The soldiers around Jeffrey checked their weapons, their movements tense and focused. This was it, the moment they had been preparing for. The transport shuddered as it touched down, and the ramp lowered with a hiss of hydraulic systems. Jeffrey led the way, his heart pounding in his chest as he stepped onto the rocky terrain. The team moved quickly and silently, their movements honed by countless missions. They reached the entrance to the base, a hidden tunnel carved into the mountainside, and began the long descent into the bowels of the facility. The air was thick with the scent of machinery and alien technology, the walls lined with conduits and pipes that pulsed with energy. Jeffrey's HUD flickered with data, mapping their progress and alerting them to any potential threats. As they moved deeper into the base, the resistance teams above made their move. The sound of explosions and gunfire echoed through the tunnels, the signal that the main assault had begun. Jeffrey's team pressed on, their focus unwavering. They knew that the success of the mission rested on their shoulders, that the fate of the entire operation depended on their ability to reach the weapon and destroy it before it could be activated. The tunnels were a maze of intersecting corridors and security checkpoints, each one more heavily guarded than the last. The Zartan had spared no expense in fortifying this facility, and it was clear that they were expecting an attack. But Jeffrey's team was prepared. They moved with the precision of a well-oiled machine, taking down the alien defenders with ruthless efficiency. There was no room for hesitation, no time for second-guessing. Every shot had to count, every movement had to be calculated. Finally, they reached the heart of the base, a massive chamber that housed the weapon. The room was dominated by a colossal machine, its surface bristling with antennae and weaponry, its core pulsing with a sickly green light. This was the doomsday device, the Zartan's last hope of crushing humanity once and for all. Jeffrey's heart raced as he approached the control console, his fingers flying over the alien interface as he attempted to bypass the security protocols. The rest of the team spread out, covering the entrances and preparing for the inevitable counterattack. They had only minutes to complete their mission before the Zartan forces would overwhelm them. The console beeped as Jeffrey gained access to the system, the alien symbols scrolling across the screen as he worked to deactivate the weapon. Sweat dripped down his face as he concentrated, the pressure mounting with each passing second. He could hear the distant sounds of battle growing louder, the Zartan forces closing in on their position. "Come on," Jeffrey muttered under his breath, his hands trembling with the strain. "Just a little more." Suddenly, the console flashed red, the system locking down as the base's AI detected the intrusion. A harsh alarm blared through the chamber, the lights dimming as the Zartan's defenses activated. Jeffrey's blood ran cold as he realized what was happening. The base was initiating a self-destruct sequence, a last-ditch effort to prevent the weapon from falling into human hands. "We've got a problem!" Jeffrey shouted over the comms, his voice tinged with panic. "The base is going to blow! We've got to get out of here!" The team sprang into action, abandoning their positions and making a break for the exit. The walls trembled as the first explosions rocked the facility, the floor buckling beneath their feet as they sprinted towards the tunnels. Jeffrey's heart pounded in his chest as he ran, the heat of the detonations scorching his back. They had to move fast, or they would be buried alive in the collapsing structure. They reached the tunnel entrance just as the base began to crumble, the walls collapsing in a shower of debris. Jeffrey led the way, his lungs burning as he pushed himself to the limit. The tunnel twisted and turned, the path ahead barely visible through the dust and smoke. He could hear the sound of his team's ragged breathing, the thud of their boots on the ground as they fought to keep up. Just as they neared the exit, a final explosion tore through the tunnel, the shockwave sending them sprawling. Jeffrey hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of him. He gasped for breath, his vision swimming as he struggled to push himself up. The tunnel was collapsing around them, the ceiling caving in as the base's self-destruct sequence reached its climax. "We're not going to make it," one of the team members shouted, their voice filled with fear. "Keep moving!" Jeffrey barked, his voice hoarse with determination. "We're almost there." With a final burst of energy, the team scrambled towards the exit, their bodies bruised and battered but their spirits unbroken. They burst out into the open air just as the tunnel collapsed behind them, a cloud of dust and debris billowing out into the night. They had made it, just barely. But the mission was not over yet. Jeffrey staggered to his feet, his body trembling with exhaustion. He looked around at his team, seeing the relief in their eyes. They had survived, but they had also succeeded. The Zartan's doomsday weapon was destroyed, and with it the aliens' best chance of victory. But the war was far from over. The Resistance still had a long road ahead, and Jeffrey knew that this victory, while significant, was just one step in a much larger battle. They would have to regroup, rebuild, and continue the fight, pushing the Zartan back until Earth was free once more. As they made their way back to the transport, Jeffrey felt a sense of pride swell in his chest. They had faced impossible odds and come out on top, not because they were the strongest or the most advanced, but because they had something the Zartan could never understand: an unbreakable will, a determination to survive, and a fierce love for their world and each other. The transport lifted off, carrying them back to the safe zone. As they flew over the ruined landscape, Jeffrey allowed himself to hope. Hope that this war would end, that humanity would rise from the ashes, stronger and more united than ever before. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges and sacrifices, but they would face it together as one people determined to reclaim their world and their future.